I woke up that morning to the sound of splintering wood, this dry, hollow crack that rolled across the pasture like someone snapping a giant ruler, and for one stupid second, I thought a tree had finally given up to the wind. Then I stepped onto my porch, coffee smoking in my hand, and saw them, a line of bison, huge as small houses, lumbering through the dawn mist, straight into Lakeshore Estate's perfect little white picket paradise. And the fence, the same fence they'd been bragging about for months, folded like a cheap card table under 1,000 pounds of horn and muscle. It hit me like the punchline I hadn't seen coming, and man, it was beautiful. My name's Jack Turner. I'm 54, and I've lived on this land my whole life, 200 acres. My grandfather carved out of wild country back when the only neighborhood was the deer in the sky. I was born in a bedroom that smelled like hay, raised with the kind of ribbed, dumb luck that only a rancher learns how to mend a fence by feel how to tell the difference between a cow and a bull when you're half asleep, how to put up with people who think country living is a weekend hobby. I raised bison because my old man did. He switched from cattle in the late 80s and liked to say bison were too stubborn to let the world tell them what to do. That line would have described him or me just fine. When Lakeshore Estates went up about 7 years back, I figured it'd be fine. City folks wanted the country aesthetic. We'd nod at each other by the road and go on with our lives. Problem is, some of them wanted the look without the reality. That's where Karen came in. Karen Miller, Queen Bee of the HOA, before the paint was dry on her porch hair, sculpted like a helmet clipboard attached to her hand as if it were part of her body. She's the kind of person who turns a good morning into a zoning lecture. And I wasn't part of the HOA. Never was, never would be. That was the rub, and for a control person like Karen, it was a splinter she couldn't leave alone. It started small, polite letters left unaddressed to me, requests to be considerate about truck noise, little needles that sting if you let them. Then signs popped up on the public road, no unauthorized vehicles beyond this point, signed, of course, by the HOA. Smart-looking board official fonts enough to confuse a delivery driver. My feed guy called me hesitant to come through, said a woman stopped him, told him it was private. I had to go wave him in myself. That was strike one. Strike two was men I didn't know taking photos along my fence line, claiming to be doing a safety inspection for the community. When I asked for credentials, they mumbled community standards and left. Word spread. Karen told anyone who'd listen that my bison were a public safety hazard. It was laughable in a way. These animals had been on that land longer than her vinyl siding. But bison can be dangerous if mishandled, and in her world, a rule book and a drone made her competent. The little things kept happening: a drone buzzing my herd during a warm afternoon, a stack of sandbags and a crude plywood dam one morning diverting water from my lower pasture, probably the HOA, cleaning up a natural flow without asking, and then the escalation: a steel padlock welded through the links of my ranch gate so a truck couldn't get in. That last one crossed the line from irritating to illegal. My ranch hand Luke found it, swore a little, and I snapped the lock off with bolt cutters and tossed the carcass in the back of my truck. At that moment, I realized Karen had moved from poking to interfering. Now, I'm not a confrontational man by nature. Growing up around livestock teaches you that anger rarely helps. So instead of storming into their quarterly meeting with a bullhorn, I started doing what a rancher does when he's got time. I watched, I documented, and I listened. Lakeshore Diner became my intelligence HQ. You learn everything there: who's on whose side, which projects are underfunded, who's complaining about what. I overheard Phil the treasurer and Denise arguing, Phil grumpy about drained budgets, Denise saying Karen refused to approve fence replacements until she got funding for landscaping. That was a good hint. Their perimeter fence was in worse shape than they wanted to admit. Turns out the HOA kept spending on appearances and not the foundation posts, leaning rails, warped wire patched like a metal quilt. I walked that fence with a camera and a notebook, every rotten post, every sagging wire, every place a determined deer could walk over. I also kept the paper trail, every letter, every friendly notice, the security cam footage from my gate showing a white SUV stopping the padlock incident documented in photos. I called my friend Mike at the county zoning office, asked some hypotheticals, and he gave me the gem I needed. If you live next to a livestock operation, your barrier has to be adequate for the species next door. If your fence is a joke and a 1,000-pound bull decides tulips look tasty, the liability lies with the weak fence owner. That little nugget was gold. And here's the twist: it wasn't me plotting a trap. Karen's own overreach set the stage. They cabled markers and flags for a perimeter enhancement project only to plant the stakes well inside my property line. They were extending a boundary in a way that trespassed on my land, and in trying to push the fence closer to the herd, they left the old sections even more neglected. They were effectively building their own undoing. So I played the long game. I called my lawyer Ben, a wiry cowboy who'd swapped a saddle for a briefcase, and told him what was up. He grinned like a man at a covered poker game and said this was cleaner than he'd hoped: easement interference, property encroachment, documented harassment. He drafted a cease and desist, but I told him hold on to it. Timing matters. Let them paint themselves into a corner. We waited. I kept the herd where they belonged, I fixed my own fences, and I let the storms do the rest. A summer wind came through, and by morning the HOA's fence sagged in 3 spots. The trail cams caught their maintenance guys inspecting and walking away without fixing a thing. They were stalling, maybe on purpose, maybe because Karen wanted to preserve the posture rather than the function. Either way, the house of cards was in place. Then came the day everything tipped. Luke called voice-tight boss gates locked again. This time it wasn't a loop chain and a padlock. They'd welded a steel plate across the gate and bolted a no-access sign to my side. A delivery was due in an hour. Rerouting would cost me a day and extra fuel. But the county sheriff, when I called, took one look and sighed. This was beyond petty, it was illegal. He took photos, filed a report, promised to pass it on to the county attorney. Legal wheels turned slow, but the evidence was stacking up. I did something simple. I opened the interior gate to the south pasture and let the herd move at their own pace toward the weak spot in the HOA fence. Bison don't panic unless provoked. They don't charge like bulls in cartoons. They test, they push, they go where the grass is better. Brutus, a bull that weighed more than some trucks nosed the rotten post, gave it a test shove, and with a crack that sounded like a starting pistol, the top rail split. The herd spilled through into tidy cul-de-sacs, into hydrangeas and fountains, and the perfect little lawns Karen loved to curate. They sniffed, they grazed, they leaned on a trellis like it was a scratching post. Chaos, sure, but not cruelty. People screamed, tires squealed, and Karen ran out in yoga pants, watering can in hand, hollering orders like she was sheriff of something. The sheriff arrived and read a few lines from county code right there in the wrecked lawn. If your neighbor keeps bison and your fence is inadequate, that's on you. The county attorney received the thick envelope I handed the sheriff: photos, letters, video clips, the padlock evidence, the drone footage, and that paperwork did the work I'd been saving it for. The HOA was cited for failure to maintain adequate barriers for trespass issues and for interfering with an established easement. Suddenly, the fines were real and insurance started to pay attention. Karen was voted out of the presidency of the HOA that week in a landslide. The board, suddenly worried about skyrocketing premiums and angry homeowners with ruined gardens, demanded changes, lawsuits followed, and the HOA agreed to rebuild the southern fence to a standard that would keep a tank out if necessary. They had to put my easement in writing, stop obstructing the road, and pick up the tab for damages. I didn't dance on anyone's porch. I didn't gloat. The satisfaction was quieter than that. It was the relief of seeing fairness do its little slow burn. There's a lesson in the middle of all that mud and smashed gnomes, and it's not a sermon, it's a kind of weathered truth. Sometimes the strongest move is patience evidence, and knowing your rights, letting someone's small, repeated cruelties become the proof of their own foolishness. When people try to weaponize rules to bully you, their arrogance often builds the scaffold for their fall. And the harder they push to control, the more dramatic their own unraveling can be. After the dust settled, life went back to its rhythm. Morning coffee on the porch, the herd grazing the sun, sliding behind the pines like an old clock winding down. Brutus still stands by the fence, sometimes sniffing the air like a guy keeping an eye on weak spots, but mostly they're content. The HOA lawns got replaced, the fountain fixed, and Karen, well, she kept her house, but her voice around the board got quiet. Power that's only built on intimidation doesn't travel far once it's tested. So here's the question I'll leave you with, and it's the kind that'll have people arguing in the comments when the law protects community order and community order starts to strangle an individual's right to earn a living and live on their land. Where should the line be drawn? Is financial consequence enough to restore fairness? Or do we need a different kind of accountability to stop that sort of small planet tyranny before it starts? Tell me what you think. Ever had a neighbor, a boss, or a committee try to control you with rules and paperwork? How'd you handle it? Drop your story in the comments. Tell me who you side with, Karen or Brutus. And if you like this slice of ranch life, hit like, subscribe, and share your own experience. Trust me, sharing it helps.
Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video.